Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, that was a nice big disappointment.
Wasn't it, though?
Yes. It was just a big series of disappointments for the weekend, really.
It's a nice emotional reset. I don't know what you're talking about. There was one disappointment this weekend. It was the Vikings playing the 49ers. No other football occurred. Why are you talking like this?
No other football occurred. Yeah. Well, we will be going over a couple of things here in just a moment, but just want to thank you guys so much for listening to the show. We will be kind of reverting to our off-season schedule here very shortly. I don't know if we'll be recording an episode next week unless the Vikings hire an offensive coordinator, in which case we will be talking about that probably at length. But just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for supporting Norse Code throughout the regular season and the playoffs. Again, you guys have been awesome. Thank you so much. If you listen to the show and you hear value in what we present to you, you can support the show in one of two different ways. You can go to paypal.me/NorseCode, which is more of a one-time subscription, or you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode as well, and that is much more of an actual subscription-based, not just a one-time thing. It just ends up sending it to once a month over to us, and you can do that in any amount you'd like. You can do $1 a month to help subscribe. You can do $3.50 to help keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay. Really, whatever you're comfortable with. And it helps keep the lights on. It helps make it so that we're able to be ad free, and Arif can enjoy the lap of luxury that podcasting and writing can give you. Sitting in the if you've been following Arif's Twitter feed this last weekend, at least you were enjoying the food of San Jose, not necessarily San Francisco.
Half the food was San Francisco because I did drive down there to meet up with the people at Athletic HQ, and I was like, well, I'm in San Francisco. It would be dumb not to, eat here. So some of the food was, but most of it's San Jose, yeah.
I was like, I was looking at the Google Maps thing. I was like, it really is in San Jose. For some reason, I wanted to say it was Santa Clara. And I don't know if that's just a suburb of San Jose, but just looking at the map, I was like, the location of that just seems off. But
yeah, so it is technically it's in Santa Clara, the stadium, but no one, I don't think anyone lives in Santa Clara. It is definitely a suburb of San Jose. Sorry for all the Santa Clara listeners we have.
Santa Clara doesn't actually exist on a map.
It's like a paper town. Yeah.
Where we're going, we don't actually need roads in Santa Clara. But you had mentioned that that the Vikings game was the only football disappointment of the weekend, and I just don't know if that's the case. I feel like our special guest has something to say. Eric, do you have something to say?
You know what other city doesn't really have a lot of fans in it right now? Harrisonburg, Virginia. That was, the home of the proud James Madison University Dukes, who were beat once again. The rubber match, the one proving what fluke a couple years back. NDSU took back what was rightfully theirs for the 8th time in 9 years. So it wasn't a completely wasted football Saturday for myself, but we've had a pretty rough weekend.
Incredible opportunity for you to celebrate your JV trophy from the college town that can only exist as a college town, unlike Harrisonburg, which certainly has imports and exports of many varieties that I won't look up right now.
My question was going to be whether or not Arif knew that it was in Harrisonburg.
I did. I Googled it 2 days ago. Yeah.
Your Dukes.
It's a proud town. Yeah, my Dukes.
Yeah, a JV trophy is better than 0 trophies, though.
They don't have 0 trophies. What? They have 1 trophy.
They do have, yes. Okay, 1.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm sorry that attending NDSU has robbed you of the ability to count, but sacrifices must be made.
I was just talking about your weekend. That was what I was trying to get at. Is your 0 for 3 weekend?
Oh, okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, I figured because Arif had spent the majority of the past couple of weeks talking up his Dukes, that it's only fair that the actual winner of the game, I say winner of the game like Eric participated,
Technically, I donated. I guess some of my funding is still probably floating around in that program.
Like the $20 I gave them for a parking ticket back in 1997.
Yeah,
no, I mean,
exactly.
I'm sure it was used to pay the players. Fine cheating institution that it is. Oh, how did they land Trey Lance? Yeah, real mystery there, guy.
Yeah, didn't you see Carson Wentz handing out wads of cash? Oh, no, wait, that was OBJ yesterday.
Yeah. Those players were all declared for the draft, and so, plus LSU said it was fake money. That's not a big problem.
Were they fake cigars, too?
I'm sure they...
every player caught on camera.
The police.
I'm just saying, every player caught on camera receiving what is apparently fake money from Odell Beckham. I believe was already eligible for the draft anyway. So no big problem there. Trey Lance, though, is a freshman. And honestly,
yes,
craven of NDSU.
He has 3 more JV trophies. He does have 3 more JV trophies to win. Maybe he'll actually throw an interception one of these years, too.
You got your money's worth. Incredible.
Yes, out of that football hotbed of Marshall, Minnesota. Yes.
How else were they able to snipe him from the Gophers? I'm just saying.
Well, Gophers probably didn't recruit. I can say this because my dad is from Marshall, Minnesota. He calls it himself. He called it the armpit of Minnesota. So maybe they just never got there.
So all of you Marshall listeners, you can tweet at Eric Thompson.
Yes.
Isn't Marcus Sherrills from there?
That would make a lot of sense.
Incredible.
Like the picture on the way into town, home of Marcus Sherrills is actually just him dropping one of the kicks this last weekend.
Oh Jesus!
Ugh.
Oh my God!
He had one job.
Yeah, literally one.
Yeah, because they wouldn't play him in nickel corner.
God.
Nope.
I did want to ask Arif how loudly he screamed at the game-ending interception in the end zone.
Well, did you get to see it live? Because you probably had to be in the press box by then, right?
I was in the press box, and I watched it via Gamecast, so I didn't actually get to see the video of it, which prepared me for it. Plus, it's a professional working environment. No one would dare scream during a game. That would be unprofessional.
No, of course
Uncouth. Not. Against decorum. Yes. We do know how the press box likes to be as stuffed shirt as possible. Okay. Well, Eric, any parting shots before we leave? You have the floor, and Eric and Arif has been taunting you all season. So,
you know what? I will be humble because the scrappy underdog Bison, who are a 1.5 underdog in this championship game, I won't rub it in that James Madison blew it as a favorite. They're the only favorite of Arif's. They were the only favorite of Arif's 3 teams, and they were, of course, they lost as a huge favorite. They're such a juggernaut power. Just nice to see a scrappy underdog win once in a while. And maybe they'll try to get back next year, but it's going to be really a tough uphill battle. With that, they can barely reload their small, meager team in their tiny little 19,000 seat stadium. It's going to be really tough for them next season. But you never know. Maybe they can.
Good.
I think
great.
I'm done now. Sure, fine.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Eric, for coming on and dancing on Arif's Takes grave. It's always a good time when you get to dunk on Arif just a little bit.
Oh no, it was my pleasure. That's all I was going to say. Anytime I possibly can, and what Arif? It's fine. It's not like the Vikings have a whole bunch of really difficult decisions to make. You didn't write about that or anything today, did you? So I'm giving you a plug.
Thank you. I needed it on my own podcast. Appreciate it.
The more plugging for Arif's work, the better at this point. All right. If you would like to read Eric's work, you can find it at the Daily Norseman. He is also at Eric_J_Thompson on Twitter. He is the resident NDSU fan and one of the most vocal ones on Twitter, not currently living in the cold ass state of North Dakota. Eric, thanks
yes,
so much.
I'm living in the warm, the beautiful climes of Mendota Heights, Minnesota. So much better than Fargo this time of year.
Well, I mean, if I'm going to search right now, where I'm at is -12, and the St. Paul-ish region is at 17. So,
well, there we go.
Just throwing that out there. All right, thanks, Eric, for coming on.
All right, thanks for having me, guys.
Yep. Thanks, Eric. Okay, do we really need to do a full review of the 49ers game? I feel like this is a post-mortem in the truest sense. Like, a good portion of what this team was is likely now dead. Like, is now going to end up being traded away, or has left for the Browns, or will be leaving in the offseason here. I think the biggest takeaway for me for the 49ers game was just how effective Ameer Abdullah was in the kick return. I feel like he was able to accomplish so much, and he had so many opportunities to do so. Ameer Abdullah was probably the main reason why the Vikings even had a chance in this game.
Yeah, from the perspective of scrimmage or all-purpose yards, yeah, he demolished it.
He was Yak King.
I'm not confident he would have gotten any more yards than if he had just kneeled it in the end zone. But yeah, from a pure yardage perspective, good job, Ameer Abdullah.
He was averaging past the 30 for nearly every single one of his kicks. I think one of them was at the 28. He was very effective. Okay,
it's like 4 yards, James.
That stuff adds up. Maybe that gets you into field goal position. I don't know. All right, let's go into this. The 49ers were able to stop Kirk Cousins and make him look silly. They were able to stop play action. They were able to stop Dalvin Cook running the ball, and they were able to stop the screen game. As far as I can tell, that leaves the Vikings with almost 0 plays that they can run.
Yeah, so that's one of the issues with the offense.
You make our quarterback look silly. Oh, you make it so that Dalvin Cook can't make it past 1 yard. Oh, this isn't going to be a good day for us at all. It's like we reverted to every single loss, every single ugly loss of the year, whether it be the 2 to the Bears or the 2 to the 2 to the Packers.
Yeah, actually, it reminded me a lot of the losses to the Packers, and I think it's that the 49ers and the Packers did a lot of similar things to take away play action. And then the Vikings' response to that is kind of just a series of plays that are just like screens that are, I'm not going to say easy to figure out because the Vikings have been pretty good in the screen game offensively, but if they're figured out, do kind of shut down the offense. So from that perspective, it felt a lot like, I think, the Packers games, which is why when people were saying, the Vikings would rather go to Green Bay than to Seattle, there's reasons for that. I think that Green Bay was not as good a team as Seattle, kind of despite what happened. But also, there's reason to worry because the Vikings just haven't shown an ability to overcome that type of defensive setup against what they do. So that was a problem, and I think that is probably the primary criticism I would have leveled against Kevin Stefanski. If he was to stay with the Vikings throughout the next year. But for the most part, a lot of people just played poorly, right? Because you had no interior offensive linemen with the ability to maintain consistently clean pocket. Cousins, on the instances he did have a clean pocket, was too skittish, checked it down a little bit too often, wasn't taking the deep shots that were available to him. It didn't perform well under pressure. He was under pressure much more often than he should have been, but even after kind of adjusting for that, he performed pretty poorly under pressure. Really, honestly, the only players that performed well were like Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, and Diggs doesn't have any stats from the game. So it's really tough to point to some really good performances. I mean, Dalvin Cook had more yards after contact than he had yards, so there's that. It might say more about the offensive line than anything else.
Yeah, it's really indicative of the fact that he wasn't able to get going. He was getting hit hard to start, and then was able to limp to the line of scrimmage.
Yeah, it was. That's always nice to see.
Yeah. I mean, Diggs did end up having a touchdown and made it feel like the Vikings were at least somewhat in the game for the first 2.5 quarters.
And Vikings fans will never forgive him for that.
Yeah. We just wanted a blowout, damn it. It was close enough. And just looking back at that play that Diggs was able to score on, the defender fell down. Like,
right. Well, because of Diggs, but yes.
Yeah. Like Diggs strolled in, and even Diggs was like, I guess I'm going to walk in here. This was backwards. Yeah, walk in backwards. This was there really wasn't a lot of good stuff to point at, and I mean you can look at the Thielen the interception that Thielen is blaming on himself. You can look at the checkdowns. You can look at the sacks, but this was an offense that was not nearly as confident or as effective as the one that showed up in New Orleans the week before.
Yeah, and I'm not entirely sure the reason why. I know some people are saying, Stefanski was distracted by the interview that he had, but I mean, like the defensive coordinator had the same interview for the 49ers, and he seemed pretty focused. I kind of agree that like the way that the schedule is set up for interviews and stuff like that, it just kind of sucks for playoff teams. But it tends to affect like the good teams, right? So it's not that big a deal. Honestly, like I'm not really sure why, like I can break down like all of the individual plays and who did well and why they didn't do well, but I can't speak to kind of the universal reason, right? That the offense performed as poorly as it did. I can point to, hey, they had a short week. The 49ers had a bye. They're coming off of, returning players from injuries. The Vikings had a couple of players get banged up. The Vikings were traveling to the West Coast, those sorts of things. And I don't know, maybe the grass thing too. You can point to those things because those are consistent with the kind of flat universal drop in performance that the Vikings saw because they're kind of universal factors that kind of apply to everybody, on the Vikings team, but it's still just kind of weird. I wouldn't say that it was like, Mike Zimmer's a bad coach, but I would say that maybe this was a failure of coaching, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, the offense just couldn't get it going, and I thought the defense played all right. Like you said, Abdullah did have ample opportunity to return kicks, so the defense wasn't perfect or anything like that. But I feel like this was more an offensive problem than it was a defensive problem, and to the extent that there were a lot of points, it was because the 49ers offense had so many opportunities and really good field position for a lot of the game. So. That's not to say the defense played well, but if I were to like kind of lay blame, I would say it's more on the offense. The defense, still gave up more yards per attempt to Garoppolo than he's had for most of the year. And, Deebo Samuel kind of ate him alive. They shut down George Kittle, which is nice, but, yeah, they by and large had problems. They got eaten up a little bit in the run game. But I would say my primary concern coming out of that game was offensive.
It definitely appeared that way, and Diggs wasn't able to really get going. But the thing that's really stuck out to me was the lack of third down conversions. And
yeah. So the Vikings end up with 7 total first downs, but that statistic is kind of a lie because they actually only got 4 first downs through the first 3 quarters. And they grabbed 3 first downs in like garbage time, right? Where, it was a little bit easier to get things done. And I believe one of those was on third down. They might have been like 1 for 10 or something like that on third down heading into the fourth quarter. But even when you give them the additional first downs that they generated in the fourth quarter, and one of them was by penalty, it wasn't even like they did it. They were 2 for 17. They had a 17% third down conversion rate on offense. Just brutal. 0% fourth down conversion rate, of course. Didn't convert the red zone attempt into a touchdown. because you remember the only touchdown came from like 40 yards out, right? So yeah, 3.3 yards a play, like everything was bad. A lot of it, I think, was poor decision making on first and second down. And I defended Stefanski after the game, just in terms of his total performance. But obviously during the game, I was complaining about like a second and long draw here or a screen there or whatever. But it did improve from the perspective of run pass balance as the game kind of continued. But it did feel like, hey, they commit this penalty on first down. That brings them back. And then the play calling is not necessarily designed to get them very far. When I kind of rewatched some of these plays, it was a little bit less concerning. I still don't love the runs on second and long, but it's too easy to focus on that because there were not very many rushing attempts by the Vikings offense. There were 10 total rushing attempts out of 42 plays, something like that. Even more than that because there were 6 sacks. So yeah, like 45 offensive plays. And only 10 of them were runs. So I wouldn't really focus too much on that. They just kind of stick out. I think, the play calling initially seemed kind of bad. When I watch it again, the play calling is all right. I mean, I wouldn't say it was stellar or anything like that. There were too many screens. And again, they were kind of running inappropriately in some points, but, for the most part, I mean, there were yards available downfield that Cousins was just declining. For whatever reason, whether it made sense because he was under pressure and he couldn't get rid of the ball quickly, or, if it was his fault and he had enough time at the top of his drop to get rid of the ball. Sage Rosenfels tweeted out, and I'll put a link to the final tweet because it's not threaded like a normal thread, but he quote tweets himself a lot, so you can just go through all the quote tweets to go backwards. But he tweets out Vikings missed opportunities from the game. I think he ends up with 7. I think 5 of them are on Cousins. One of them is on Thielen, and I kind of forget the other one. But he tweets out a couple of them. But 5 out of his 29 passing attempts, not to include his 6 sacks. So out of 35 dropbacks, 5 is a lot of potential big plays to miss. And then another one was on Thielen. Again, we already mentioned the interception that he took it upon himself to blame himself for, and no one contradicted, so it's probably his fault. So I'll link the Sage Rosenfels thread. But yeah, there's a lot of problems offensively just in terms of getting stuff done on first and second down, which created some bad third down opportunities. But again, like on third and long, your conversion rate is typically much higher than 17% anyway. So I wouldn't even say that's the reason. If you just look at third and long, I mean, the Vikings performed poorly there too. A lot of it, were throws short of the sticks. And that's kind of where my biggest problem is that, you end up with, I think through 3 quarters, a 70% completion rate and 4 first downs. And I was taking a look at this and I was like, that is so unusual to me to have 12 completions, on I think 17 attempts and only have 4 first downs. So I looked at who the most and least aggressive quarterbacks in the NFL were. So the least aggressive quarterback in the NFL by depth of target will surprise no one. It was Teddy Bridgewater, who's inherently a fairly conservative quarterback who was in an offense that's just insanely conservative to begin with. Drew Brees' offense, threw the ball deep less than every other offense in the NFL except for the 49ers offense. And you'd think, having those kind of 2 similar offenses back to back would be a benefit for the defense. But anyway, and I was like, well, Bridgewater doesn't throw very deep downfield. He's got the lowest depth of target in the NFL. What happens when he gets 12 completions? Well, for every 12 completions he gets, he ends up with 6 first downs, not 4, which I think that's actually a pretty tremendous difference between, like 50% and 30% or something like that. And so, that's the most conservative, right? And then I looked at who the worst quarterback is at generating first downs. So first downs per attempt. And so I looked at, per 17 and Bridgewater's in the middle of the pack. He generates an average amount of first downs per attempt because his completion rate is so high. So his, first downs per completion kind of add up, but per attempt, it's Josh Rosen and it's 4. So he managed to replicate the per attempt first down numbers of Josh Rosen. That sucks. That's just brutal. I mean, the offensive line probably was the primary reason, but it's just so difficult for me not to look at the opportunities Cousins has and missed. The amount of tackles for loss in the game were pretty tremendous. There's a reason that Cook only averaged 2 yards an attempt. The sacks in the game, there were 6 sacks on 35 attempts. That was pretty tremendous. The coverage errors or not the coverage errors, the incompletions that come on pressures, just because of those pressures. I mean, that's a big deal, but I just really think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that even when the offense was able to get the ball into playmakers' hands, they weren't able to do anything with it. And I don't want to dog Kirk for the screens that were called. That has a big part to do with the low yards per completion and stuff like that. And kind of negative yards on those plays. I think he had 8 passes thrown behind the line of scrimmage. Most of those were just not on him. That's just the play call. So, again, there's offensive problems in terms of the way the plays were called. But, there's just so many missed opportunities on offense that, the offensive line created, or Cousins created, and they just kind of built on each other, right? That the problems of the offensive line magnified the problems of the Cousins, and the problems of the Cousins magnified the problems of the offensive line. So, yeah, it was pretty brutal.
At one point, I was trying to figure out if a play was actually a designed screen or if it just kind of broke that way. He just sat there I don't know if he meant to do that to Irv Smith, but there he goes. It was just... Yeah. Oh,
I think Irv did something with that one too.
Yeah, he got a couple of yards. He was touched immediately, and then managed to make it about 4 or 5, if I remember correctly. But yeah, it was just ugh. The defensive side of the ball wasn't terrible. We had we did have a nice interception. There was a fumble. I mean, but it seemed like a lot of the bounces that went our way in New Orleans absolutely did not go our way in San Francisco.
Yeah. I was kind of surprised because I expected, if the Vikings were going to lose this game, that Xavier Rhodes would get torched, right? And it's not like he had a good game, but he actually didn't really have that bad of a game. 45 yards allowed in coverage, but really all of it was one long gain to Kendrick Bourne. Plus the other touchdown he gave up to Kendrick Bourne. But yeah, he had a pretty good pass deflection on Deebo Samuel. He did a really good job on Emmanuel Sanders. Again, he didn't have a good game, but he had a better game than I kind of expected, and I would have expected, a game from him would have looked pretty bad. Trey Waynes did all right. I don't think he did spectacularly. PFF logs him with 3 targets and no completions. I think I probably disagree with that. I'd have to look pretty specifically at why I would disagree with that, because that doesn't seem right to me. I kind of logged it a little bit differently, but, that wasn't too bad. Sendeo got a little bit kind of toasted in the slot, not a ton, 2 targets, 34 yards. But I don't think he played as well as he did against New Orleans. I think that they just kind of saw what the Vikings had done against New Orleans and found ways to kind of overcome that. Anthony Harris had a really good game. Barr had a fine game. Kendricks had a pretty tremendous game. Harrison Smith did all right. Eric Wilson did pretty good in coverage and really poor against the run, which is just kind of who he is. That's all he does. But yeah, the defense didn't play lights out. Again, there were some coverage errors, but Everson did okay. I don't think he logged any official pressures, but I thought, he was able to create some push. Daniil Hunter played really, really well. We didn't see any push up front. I think even Linval Joseph played poorly, but for the most part, the defense did all right. They didn't have a spectacular game or anything like that. They had some critical errors. Again, there was just this one drive where they ran the ball 12 times, were able to set up a touchdown. And that's where I think kind of Linval Joseph's game kind of broke down. They needed him to play better in that situation. Eric Wilson, they kind of ran at him a lot and he wasn't able to get much done. There were problems there. I think Anthony Barr, where you would probably want to criticize him, is kind of in the middle of the game, that kind of run defense from him. But yeah, for the most part, defense didn't play well, but they didn't play, completely awful. And you kind of have to account for the fact that they were just kind of on the field forever. Because at the end of the first half, the score's not that bad. What was it? 10 to 14?
10 to 14,
like
yeah.
Yeah, it didn't feel like it. It felt like the 49ers were blowing them out of the water, but 10 to 14, it didn't feel that bad. And then the defense has to take the field for ever after that. And They don't do that well. And I'm not a huge time of possession guy when it comes to explaining defensive underperformance, but the defense is going to look a lot worse when there are more possessions. And the 49ers certainly had a high number of possessions as a result of the Vikings, either punting or failing to convert on fourth down. In fact, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Yeah, they had 2 more possessions than the Vikings. So, that played a pretty big role. And all of those came, I think they had an equal number of possessions at halftime. So all those came in the second half. That makes a difference.
Yeah, I was going to say, it doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with defense's performance necessarily, but if it's going to be that lopsided, it can't help but be actually involved in some way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And, time of possession is a two-way stat, right? If the defense had gotten off on third downs, it probably would look a lot better, but it builds up, right? When they keep giving the ball back.
Yeah. And as you had said, there was the play with, there was the drive with like 12 runs. The 49ers were having absolutely no problem running the ball on the Vikings for good yardage. It seemed like every time.
Yeah, especially I think in the middle of the game, because I think at the beginning of the game and at the end of the game, and the end of the game doesn't count because they're trying to run off the clock. But at the beginning of the game, they were doing all right against the run. But it was kind of the middle of the game. They either found kind of a crease. They were able to move Linval Joseph, it's so frustrating because, that interior offensive line for the 49ers is just not that great. So for them to be able to kind of just move Linval Joseph around, that's frustrating. And again, Eric Wilson gets kind of blown up at the point of attack a couple of times. These were the drives that Anthony Barr didn't show up in the run game, to kind of counterbalance, the fairly all right play that he had elsewhere. It kind of sucked. It looks like, the 49ers officially end with 4 yards an attempt, but that's with like 4 Jimmy Garoppolo runs for a total of 0 yards. So, my guess is, it's closer to 5 yards an attempt. And they've got, these runs at the end of the game plus some kneels that kind of skew things, against the Niners. But, it was a brutal game, defending against the run. And I think a lot of it just had to do with the play of the interior defensive line. It would have been nice if Armon Watts was healthy. Maybe, on those drives, they would have put him in, next to Linval Joseph. We saw a lot of Jaleel Johnson, so it's not like they weren't considering putting a nose tackle body at the 3 technique position. But, Armon Watts is a better player, and it would have been nice to have him there. That probably would have played a somewhat small difference in being able to force the Vikings to get the ball again. But again, the offense wasn't performing. So like how many possessions? Because they had 5 3-and-outs. Let me take a look at this possession list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 3 and okay. All right.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
That.
Three possessions of negative net yardage. God
it was not a banner day for the Vikings offense, to be sure.
Yeah, this is why I can't be that mad at the defense. Again, I'm not a huge time of possession guy, but it's so hard to win in the NFL when you just have 2 fewer possessions, right? Okay, fine. Time of possession is a relevant factor in terms of determining who's tired and how that affects on-field play. But the Vikings didn't have a single drive over 7 plays, right? And one of them was a 40-yard play. So, there's nothing you can do. And the thing is, the Vikings offense was otherwise, they didn't commit that many penalties. I think it was 1 penalty, right? They had 3 of their 4 first downs in the first 3 quarters on that one drive. Just brutal. So you take a look at the drives that aren't 3-and-outs, and they're 5 plays, 6 plays, and 7 plays. They just barely qualify as not 3-and-outs.
Yeah.
My word. My word. And
the thing is that this team, to paraphrase one of my favorite lines from announcer Mauro Ronaldo, this team has occasionally shown up to games and had been a tank, had been a force. And the question was whether or not this tank that was showing up in San Francisco was going to be a Sherman or whether it was going to be a septic. And this was clearly a septic tank out there. It was just, for all of the ways that New Orleans seemed like a coaching success, this seemed like a coaching failure. And again, it's hard to point fingers at the directions of who's actually responsible for this loss, other than possibly the offense. But man, it was just such a letdown for the end of the season, and the fact that this team will be changed very dramatically moving forward, which we might as well get into now, kind of wrapping up things, because Kevin Stefanski and our defensive coordinator are both out.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I've been on a couple of Browns podcasts to talk about Stefanski and like my weird ardent defense of this guy. But I think it's pretty big. So there's a couple of things at play here to talk about. The first, I think, is that I think it's difficult to disambiguate the role that both Stefanski and George Edwards played. And when discussing them, it's very easy to apply the analysis of one of them to the other. So, for example, I'm not incredibly concerned about the loss of George Edwards, right? I don't think he played as big a role on that defense as a defensive coordinator typically does. And I don't think that's a controversial statement either. But if you said the same about Stefanski, I would disagree, even though on the surface it kind of looks pretty similar. But I think that there's a couple of things. The first, I think it's non-trivial that Stefanski was a play caller, right? Like I think that that's more than a small difference between him and Edwards. But I think the other things are, first, Stefanski's role as a play caller and his role in the offense oversaw the most effective and efficient Vikings offense we have seen since Favre, right? Since 2009. That's over a decade where we haven't had an offense this potent either in points per game or points per drive. They were sixth in points per drive. Like, I feel like people forget that because of how disappointing the San Francisco game was, how disappointing some of the divisional games were, and they forget they like destroyed, the Chargers and the Falcons, and, they led a 20-point comeback against the Broncos, and I know a lot of people are thinking like, well, they couldn't beat up against good teams. But, I think a lot of the teams that they played, they didn't seem like good teams down the stretch. And I think the first time they played the Lions were a pretty threatening team. And things just kind of fell apart for them. I think when they played the Dallas Cowboys, the Cowboys started off really strong and then just kind of cooled off by the end of the season. I thought the Cowboys, at the time were a pretty good team. For some reason, the Eagles finished above 500. So if you want to count them, you can count them. But, they beat the snot out of those teams. And I think that that's pretty relevant too. It's nice to be able to beat good defenses. And they should have done a better job of it. But like the previous Vikings teams couldn't even do that against bad defenses. So like this is an unquestionable upgrade. And it's not just because you had Cousins, right? Because this was the best and most efficient year of Cousins' career by CPOE, by I think PFF grade, certainly by adjusted net yards per attempt. I think he's had 1 year that was better in terms of passer rating. That's when he had Sean McVay, as his offensive coordinator in 2015. But this was the most efficient year that the Vikings offense had. And so the question is, how much does Stefanski play a role in that offense? And how much does Edwards play a role in the defense that I would have argued was the number one defense in 2017. By some metrics was number two. Was a pretty good defense in 2018 and in 2016, surrounding 2017. Somehow ended up top 5 in points in 2019. Still feels kind of wrong. I think like 7th in points per drive. So it's not as if, they were like a top 5 defense every time they took the field. But, it seems like a pretty good defense, but I think the issue here is kind of who handles game plans, who handles adjustments, who calls plays. I think that's important. Who plays a lead role in, installation development, and philosophy and so on. And with Stefanski, I'm very confident that he took the lead on almost all of those roles. And what's really important here is that he had veto power, where Edwards did not have any veto power. And so, him leaving means less in terms of the loss of kind of leadership and the type of input that you put in to the input that you put in, good phrase, into the defense. So Stefanski leaving, I'm pretty concerned by. There's this like sense that, cause he's running Kubiak's system, and he is, right? They brought in Dennison to install, the zone blocking scheme, and they worked a bunch of play action off of bootlegs, which is a Kubiak classic. That somehow, his role as an offensive coordinator is like diminished. And that doesn't make a ton of sense to me because like systems are not magic. Otherwise, like the Bengals would have been great this year. Cause they were running, Zach Taylor's offense with like the the Sean McVay system. And it like wasn't, right? Like we know that you can have really good systems that don't produce great play callers. Otherwise, Brad Childress would still be the head coach of the Vikings, right? Because he's an Andy Reid disciple. And that didn't turn into an amazing offense, right? So you have to have a good play caller in order to lead your offense. You can't just have, quote unquote, good system. We've seen so many good systems lead to other play callers getting opportunities and those play callers not doing much with those opportunities. I mean, the defensive version of this is the Pete Carroll cover 3. Right? Like how many times have we seen the cover 3 exported and onto other teams, the Pete Carroll cover 3, and those defenses just kind of fall apart. I mean, the Jaguars had to go through 3 defensive coordinators from that system before they found one that was actually able to turn that defense into something really good. You can take a look at the Atlanta defense that has that cover 3 system. It's always been bad, right? Since they grabbed a cover 3 guy. The San Francisco had to abandon the cover 3 in order to be good. Yeah, the systems are not magic. This idea that, because Kubiak was a big part of the offense or a big part of the offensive design or lent a big part of the offensive playbook means that there's not going to be a step back and arguably there's going to be a step forward, I think is kind of ridiculous. I think if the offense does well, it'll be because the next offensive coordinator, who I expect is Clint Kubiak, is good. Right. And it's not because, Kubiak creates these magic systems where suddenly your offensive play callers are good. I mean, like, was the Denver offense like amazing? When Kubiak was the offensive assistant there? No. So come on. That's ridiculous. This was the best year of Cousins' career, from an efficiency perspective. So, I don't know. He had pretty good play callers before. Sean McVay was one of them. In fact, that's another example. Matt Cavanaugh was a Shanahan disciple and did not lead Cousins to have a remarkable or amazing statistical year. And it got to the point where they didn't feel comfortable extending Cousins to a long-term deal. Like, systems are not magic, and Stefanski did a really good job. That's worrisome to me because he had final control, final veto power and everything. And they don't bring in Kubiak if Stefanski doesn't okay it, which I think is a lot different than, with like George Edwards. If Jerry Gray left earlier, right, instead of just this year, if Jerry Gray had left earlier and Mike Zimmer wanted to bring in, defensive backs coach, George Edwards would have no say. Right? He wouldn't be able to be like, nope, not that guy. Zimmer would have been like, tough. I like him. Like, that's it. Right? Whereas we're bringing Kubiak in, Stefanski could have just said no. Right? And he didn't. Which I think says a lot for Stefanski, but it also means that he ultimately had control over it. There's a couple of people who have replied to my threads on this saying, Zimmer said that bringing Kubiak in is the best decision he's ever made as a head coach. And I was there when he said those comments. It's not like I forgot about that. He's talking about the kind of advice that a former head coach can give to a current head coach. He's really talking a lot about the head coach specific duties that he has and how to handle different situations as a head coach and how to develop processes as a head coach. That's what he's talking about. Obviously he appreciates the tremendous contribution that Kubiak made to the offense, but when that quote is about the advice and consultation role that he provides directly to Mike Zimmer. I don't know. Stefanski did a pretty good job for most of the season. He obviously screwed up in the San Francisco game. I don't think that defines him. He had a pretty good game plan against the Saints. And he had a pretty good game plan in some big games. I thought he did well against Seattle. They scored 30 points. Obviously, 7 of them came off of a defensive score. But they scored more points per drive in that game than an average offense does, especially an average offense against Seattle. So, he did a pretty good job in some big games. He did a pretty poor job in some other games. He designed an offense that Cousins was more comfortable with than in a long time. And I think one really good indicator of this is that PFF has a way to evaluate coaching contributions, which I've talked to them because I developed a way to quickly scan an offensive coordinator's contributions by taking a look at the total talent based off of PFF grades of a unit, weight it based off of how important that unit is, and then project how many points per drive that they should score. And that's how I came to the conclusion that DeFilippo was a bad offensive coordinator because the amount of talent that they had by PFF grade was way larger than the amount of points that they were able to put per drive. And there's a lot of complicating factors here. I think over the course of a season, you just don't have enough drives to completely eliminate all variables. It's not a perfect metric or anything like that. But it's pretty good, and it does a pretty good job of kind of predicting which offenses might blow up because of a switching coordinator. But you have to have a good coordinator, and PFF does something pretty similar internally to evaluate coordinators. And they found that Stefanski did a great job of producing more points on that offense than there is available talent. And I saw people complain about that because they don't like Stefanski and they see a lot of talent on this offense. And they're like, hey, they've got, 2 Pro Bowl capable receivers. They've got like a young ingenue tight end. They've got, a touchdown machine at the other tight end spot. They've got a great running back. Of course they're going to produce points. They've got a Pro Bowl quarterback. And it's like, well, first, there's a lot of Pro Bowl quarterbacks these days. But second, your offensive line's contributions count a ton, and they were able to score points beyond that. And they were like missing Adam Thielen for half the year, and they were still able to score points. So I am concerned about what's going to happen at offensive coordinator. At defensive coordinator, I am not extraordinarily concerned. Edwards still plays a really important role in game planning, even if he's not the lead game planner. He plays an important role in like development and setting the development schedules for all the other coordinators. It's obvious that that's going to be an issue, but the Vikings chose to let Edwards go. They did not choose to leave Stefanski go. So I think that is an indicator too. Jerry Gray, I'm a little bit concerned about that. My sense, this is a total guess. I have no sources on this. My guess is that Jerry Gray requested to leave and the Vikings granted it. And my guess is that he's not concerned with the organization. I think that he sees that there's not a lot of opportunities for advancement on the defensive side of the ball with the Vikings. Because, George Edwards wasn't getting any calls to be a head coach or anything like that, right? Because he's not in charge of that defense. And if he can't get promoted out, what are the coordinators going to do? They can't get promoted out either. So I suspect that Jerry Gray wanted to leave, 1. And 2, I suspect he wanted to leave not because he dislikes what's happening in Minnesota, but because there's more opportunities for advancement elsewhere. Maybe that's rose-colored glasses, but I think the Jerry Gray thing is super concerning. He's done a phenomenal job at safety. He's done a really good job at cornerback. In terms of developing that secondary talent. So, and he played a big role in helping identify players like Holton Hill and so forth. So, concerned about that. But those are my thoughts on the coaching vacancies.
Is Adam Zimmer going to be the defensive coordinator moving forward?
Probably. Is he qualified technically? Yeah, I can't knock the resume of Clint Kubiak or Adam Zimmer, right? I think the resume is fine for a first-time coordinator. Quarterbacks coach very often becomes a coordinator. Linebackers coach very often becomes a coordinator. Great. Does the offense or the defense really need new blood? Maybe. I don't know that fresh ideas are as critical as some people are saying. I'm just concerned that the Vikings arbitrarily limit their talent pool because of nepotism. A lot of good coaches in the NFL were sons of coaches. McVay's a good example. Shanahan's a good example. They were sons of coaches. And they got their foot in the door because they were sons of coaches, and they were able to spend more time around football because they were sons of coaches. So it's not as if it's impossible to have, really good coaches come from a family of coaches. I'm just concerned that the Vikings might be limiting their talent pool. And it seems really likely because in the Monday presser, Zimmer said that they were looking to maintain continuity. And that continuity is really important, especially he mentions this, especially in the context of the offensive side of the ball. So I really do expect it to be Clint Kubiak. But he talked a lot about the importance of continuity and promoting up from within is a great way to maintain continuity. Rick Dennison, I don't think is a candidate, and I don't think that they typically promote tight ends coaches to offensive coordinator, although I guess Pat Shurmur's an exception. So I really think it's going to be, Clint Kubiak. So yeah, I think Adam Zimmer's the defensive coordinator. I think Clint Kubiak's the offensive coordinator. If the offense and the defense are statistically the same next year, maybe they perform better in situational scenarios, like when play action gets taken away or whatever. I don't know. But if they're statistically similar, then statistically the Vikings will be a playoff team again. And that's not just because they won 10 games and 10 games are playoff teams, but rather having a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense is like a pretty good formula for getting into the playoffs. So statistically, they're very similar. That's really good news. Obviously, within the context of particulars, like, what happens when plan A and plan B are ruined, what happens, at cornerback, that needs to be kind of fixed or whatever, where those points come from or where those yards come from. that's going to matter. That's going to kind of change whether it's going to be 10 wins or 9 wins or 11 wins, and whether or not they're going to be able to game plan effectively against, whoever they play in the playoffs. But statistically, if they're a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense, you can't be anything but happy about that. So in theory, continuity is fine, especially because the defensive coordinator position matters maybe a little bit less. Again, I'm worried about technical development there. But offensively, yeah, the actual play caller matters. We'll see if Clint Kubiak is as good or better than Stefanski. My worry is that a lot of the problems Stefanski had this year as a play caller, and again, there definitely were problems, right? He didn't have a plan C, for when teams took away plan A, play action, plan B, screen game. He didn't have a plan C, and that showed up in 3 big games. But my concerns is that Stefanski, those problems are not that different from first year coordinators. I mean, Kyle Shanahan in 2015, I don't think that was necessarily his first year as a coordinator, but because I think he was a coordinator in Cleveland, but it looked very similar, right? He didn't have a plan C. And then he grew and became a really fantastic coordinator, and then became a great head coaching candidate. I am concerned that a first year coordinator will once again have first year coordinator problems. So that is my issue. I have no idea if Kubiak is good or bad as a play caller. We'll see.
Well, it's going to be interesting. And again, this Vikings team is going to change drastically. And next episode, we'll talk more about the free agents, more about the hard contract questions that are going to end up having to come up, because this is a team that doesn't have a lot of cap room. This is a team that's going to have to make some tough decisions, and all of that. So let's just go to the mailbag and over to Chris, who asks, is what's happening with all the coaches more of a mutiny or a jailbreak?
I don't think it's that bad. One got hired to be a head coach. One's contract expired and they chose not to renew it. And then one left, and that's it. There's no other coaches leaving, right? I know Andrew Kramer tweeted something. I actually never saw the tweet. Tweeted something that made it seem like Drew Petzing was leaving. He's not. He's staying with the Vikings for the 2020 season, as far as we know. So it's 3 coaches left, and only one of them wanted to leave. So I'm not bothered by it.
Also, do you think it's more important to find a solution to the Griffin and 3-Tech, or a Reef and Elfline combination?
I thought that was about me for a solution to a reef. I'm sorry. I didn't know I needed to be fixed.
How do you solve a problem like a reef?
So the bigger problem is the question is defensive line or offensive line, essentially. I'm more worried about the offensive line. The defensive line, I just trust Andre Patterson to figure something out. I know they found Tom Johnson off of the Saints waivers, right? He was playing in the Arena Football League, and then he played for the Saints for half a second, and the Vikings sign him, and he becomes one of the best backup 3 techniques in the league. I don't know, they just kind of find defensive linemen. I'm not that concerned about it. You probably have to shed Griffin's contract to create cap space, especially to re-sign Anthony Harrison, stuff like that. The offensive line is just tougher, right? I think you free up a bunch of cap room by getting rid of Riley Reef, but I don't know that you can just get rid of him. Because now you have 2 holes, right? One at tackle and one at guard. Maybe you can restructure him, move him to guard, and then draft a tackle. Maybe you can restructure him, keep him a tackle, and draft a guy to play guard. I don't know. But I don't know how to solve that problem, because it's difficult to find offensive linemen, especially if you're the Vikings.
Yes. For whatever reason, they just don't travel well north. Michael asks, 09, 15, 17, and 19. Looking back in 10 years, which one of these heartbreaks is going to hurt the worst? It's 09 and it's not even close, right?
I can't imagine it's anything. It's got to be 09. Yeah. I don't remember believing in a team more out of all those teams than 09. Mm-hmm. Because 17 was it was literally a miracle, right? You can't, they were just playing games with contested catches, and it would have been a super sweet story to write at the end of the year to be this team crazy. Anyway, bye, Case.
Yeah.
It was just wild. And I don't think people Like, it's a gut punch to see what happened in Philadelphia. It sucked. It was super emotional. The Vikings got their hopes up just to let them down. But it wasn't like, I don't want to say it was like a paper tiger or anything like that, or that it was hollow hope, but rather the hope wasn't like structured around that much or that foundationally established, right? Like, it was just like, we saw Case Keenum, throw some dropped interceptions, if things go our way, he plays a style of football, kind of like Ryan Fitzpatrick, right? Where, things break the right way, you win. That's fantastic. But I don't think that 17 team inspired as much confidence as the 2019. I mean, Brett Favre, what did he throw? 33 touchdowns and 7 interceptions that year?
It was ridiculous. Anybody who was on the offense was made to look like a star. 09 really did feel like the team of destiny. If I was going to rank these, I think I would go 09, 17, 19, and then 15, just because I never had any belief that the Vikings were going to be able to beat the Seahawks in that game. Like, the ending sucked, don't get me wrong.
Yeah, the ending, that was probably the worst non-09 ending, right? 09 obviously had the worst ending too, but I think the ending of like 17 and 19 was just like a slow burn, right? The ending of so that ending is bad.
17 was just like, 17 was over by the first quarter. Like, it was, crap. This year, it was over by the third quarter. And it was frustrating, but there just wasn't anything to do. And you have to remember that it's the 6 seed versus the 1 seed. And like, okay, well, this is probably what should happen if the 6 seed faces the 1 seed. But 09 taking the cake, and it's not even close.
Right. I mean, well, especially because, like, the things that make some of these work are, like, grievances, right? Like, the Vikings have a grievance against the Saints because they, like, cheated, right? That makes it so much worse than, like, oh, yeah, we lost because it was negative 27 out and Blair Walsh forgot to kick. Oh, that's not the Seahawks' fault. They didn't play, like, any especially dirty, right? So it's just like, and, like, Peterson, like, fumbled it at one point off of a reception, and I mean, the Vikings just kind of hurt themselves in that game, right?
Yeah.
Teddy
Peterson
didn't throw a touchdown. Yeah, right. Yeah. Like, you don't throw a touchdown in a game. I mean, how upset can you be that you lose? Yeah. So, that's part of it. The 09, I don't think it's close. 19, I feel like because of the divisional games, Vikings fans are just kind of beaten down. The Saints game was incredible. And again, it was one of the best experiences I've ever had, in sports, regardless whether or not it was like covering it as a reporter or, being a blogger or just being a fan in the stands. Is maybe one of the best experiences I've ever had. So I don't want to say it like, 19 didn't have its moments of creating hope for the Vikings, but I just feel like after the Saints game, maybe not an hour after, but like a day after the Saints game, I think a lot of Vikings fans were like, that'd be pretty cool if they kept this run going. Like, it didn't really feel like, like at least 17, I think had, there's a lot of big plays in 17 that you can recall, as you're kind of heading into the Eagles game. And the problem with the Eagles game is that it's a backup quarterback, right? And so it feels really beatable, right? The Eagles had lost players. The 49ers gained 3 defensive players for that game. So, yeah, I don't really think that, that 19 is all that high on that list. I think it goes, to me, the most disappointing is 09. Then I think it's 17 because I think the Miracle added some. I think you're right that 15's at the bottom. That was a very grinded out team. It didn't really feel like, and obviously I'm a huge Teddy guy, but it didn't really feel like this team was dominant in any really big way.
We were playing with house money for 15 is what was happening.
Yeah. The fact that they hosted that game is wild to me. Like, yeah, they won the division, like people normally do. Like, it's just like, what, really?
This is a thing, right? This is something that people do. Great. Let's play this outdoors in weather that could kill a moose. Sure. Be sure
to bring styrofoam so that when you sit on the metal bleachers, your ass doesn't get frozen. So yeah, that's okay. I remember that they tweeted out that there was going to be caribou coffee at the game, and I tweeted out, "Oh, the Vikings were handing out caribou," and I forgot. Like, I had like national reporters following me too at the time. This is like before that even made sense, right? It was 2015. Yeah. And a bunch of national reporters were like, what, they're bringing elk to the game? I don't, what? I was like, no, it's a local coffee chain. No, I see your confusion, because you don't know anything about Minnesota.
Oh. Like all the people from Seattle who are just like, you're like, no, it's called it's Caribou. It's like, Starbucks? No, coffee.
Starbucks.
To the point where was it you that had the Starbucks like logo at your Airbnb?
Yes. Oh my God.
I couldn't remember if it was you or if it was somebody else.
The thing is, like, when I was like walking through Seattle, I didn't see like that many Starbucks like coffee cups. Like, I saw a lot of Starbucks.
Well, yes.
Like, yeah, I mean, I saw 3 in one street corner. It was maybe a bit much, but like, I mean, people really like all these other coffee shops in Seattle, but like tourists, the coffee from Seattle for tourists are Starbucks or Pete's if you're lucky. Like, those are the two. So I was at an Airbnb, that's obviously catered towards tourists. So I got a giant Starbucks mermaid in my Airbnb. Ya assholes.
It was certainly something. I remember seeing the picture of that and just going, I am so glad for mine. Right.
Yeah. I didn't even, as I was, so A, I never went to a Starbucks. But B, as my Uber driver was driving me to the Airbnb, they were like, hey, there's the original Starbucks roastery. It's still going, or whatever they call it. Roast house? Roastery? I don't know.
Something like that.
And I was like, great. And he's like, yeah, do you want to visit? And I was like, just take me to my hotel. I just don't really care.
Like, I'm a Caribou snob. Just leave me alone. Bill Bodke asks, on what happened in San Francisco, I thought a particular quote from Zimmer's press conference was revealing. We emptied our bucket pretty good the week before. Maybe that had something to do with it. This suggests Zimmer's coaching magnum opus in New Orleans left San Francisco with an open book of film traits to exploit on a short week. If you were Zimmer, knowing what you know now, would you have done anything differently?
No, you needed to empty the ammo box, as it were, against New Orleans. It was a brilliant coaching clinic. Right, so maybe the best coach game I've seen Zimmer craft. Maybe his first game against the McVay's Rams was really remarkable too, but incredible. So I don't think he should have done anything differently. The problem is there's just only so much you can do when you don't have a nickel corner. So you kind of have to construct it that way. The Saints couldn't adjust. And you know, that's a credit to the Vikings. I don't think that, there's really much they could have been able to do. Maybe just try to get lucky against San Francisco. That doesn't always work out. And obviously this time it didn't. So that's fine. Should they have been a little bit better prepared for San Francisco defensively? Maybe a little bit. The issue is I don't think that anything schematically they did really killed him. And in fact, you know, they identified the biggest threat towards Kittle and neutralized him. If they were able to stop the San Francisco run game, which is like not a sentence I say very often, they would have probably held them to far fewer points. You know, instead of 27 points, you know, it could have been 20 points or even less. Like, I think, you know, if they stop the run game, and I don't think that's a schematic thing. I don't think that, you know, what they did on film really did a lot. Like, I don't think that they were like, now we used all of our Linval Joseph's good plays. Now we got to use the bad ones. That sucks. So I don't think it was like that. I think that they just kind of got beaten, by being the less healthy team, the team that didn't have as much rest going into the game, that was just not as fresh coming off the bus, and a team that was, you know, for whatever reason, you know, to use the cliche, out physicaled. But I mean, they got blown off the ball. So I think that was the defensive problems. It's not as if they didn't give up, you know, yards to the air or anything like that. They obviously did, but like, that, my concern is not the schematic advantage San Francisco had. I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo was held to below a 60% completion rate. He was held to below 7 yards an attempt. The longest gain was only 22 yards through the air. In fact, the longest gain on the ground was only 11. They just kept doing it. They grabbed an interception. And then after the interception, they just decided they didn't want to throw the ball. That's a win. If you scare them away from throwing the ball for whatever reason, and again, they had the lead, but if you scared them away from throwing the ball for whatever reason, great. Now instead of, 7 yards through the air, they're going to try to get 5 on the ground. That's good. But they couldn't win on the ground. So I think schematically, I think they did a pretty good job again.
All right. There is some breaking news that it looks like the Brad Childress, the senior offensive assistant,
amazing,
may be leaving Chicago in order to go to Cleveland to help Kevin Stefanski. So
Stefanski doesn't deserve this.
No, he truly does not. I do feel bad for him at this point. Let's go to Kane, who asks, do you think the Vikings draft a quarterback if if one they like falls to them?
No. So I'm going to be covering the offseason later this week in a piece with The Athletic. I don't think so. So there's a couple of problems here. The first is that unless the Vikings are in, I think, a complete rebuild. So they're not at the spot where the Packers were in 2005, right? Where they could make a quote unquote luxury pick in the first round with a quarterback who fell. The Packers didn't have, they had holes, but they didn't have as many holes as I think the Vikings do. The problem here is to make these kinds of picks like the Chiefs did, when they moved up for Mahomes. Or the Ravens, right? Who, they needed some receivers, but for the most part, they had a pretty decent team, when they drafted Lamar. And again, they drafted a tight end before they drafted Lamar. But in order to make these kinds of picks, you need to be just a little bit more comfortable with the state of your team. And the Vikings are in this kind of weird, I wouldn't call it purgatory. Maybe you'd call it the Marvin Lewis zone. I don't know, where they're competitive enough to make the playoffs and are clearly a playoff caliber team, but they're not so competitive that they can kind of take a step back and draft a quarterback in the first round and sacrifice the opportunity cost of the player that you could get that could help you, maybe not right away, maybe right away, and immediately kind of improve the nature of your offense or the nature of your defense in some way. So it would be good because, who knows, if it makes sense to extend Kirk Cousins or whether or not they will extend Kirk Cousins. So to have a developmental quarterback waiting in the wings, that'd be really good. And in fact, it would be much better than a lot of other picks they could make in the first round, even in the medium term or the short term. But there are just better picks for the short term, like an offensive lineman, like a cornerback that also happen to help you in the long term too, because you get to keep that player for a while. The second part is that from the perspective of extending this window, so the Vikings have kind of a middle-aged, as it were, for the NFL defense, where their window is going to be snapping shut relatively soon with the players that they currently have. Players like Kendricks and Barr, maybe we're past Griffin, but like Harrison Smith, we're already past Rhodes, but they've got a couple of corners and stuff like that. Where in order to kind of keep some of these guys or to bolster that window, it would make more sense to extend Cousins. And if you extend Cousins to reduce his cap hit this year, to make room to re-sign Anthony Harris and so on, if you extend Cousins, then you can't really draft a guy, because if he's good, you're better off trading him. And then now you've flipped a quarterback for future picks that you can't use for 3 years, right? So now you've turned a first round pick this year into a first round pick 2 years from now. Great. So if you extend Cousins, you can't really develop that guy because he's going to leave by the time Cousins' contract ends. But if you extend Cousins, you do have the opportunity to improve the other areas. So the problem is, if you draft a guy, the way the Vikings are constructed with their cap space, if you draft a guy, you're punting on you might as well just rebuild, right? And if you don't draft a guy, then you can use those assets to maintain your window. It's tough. I mean, that was the whole point of my piece that I wrote at The Athletic, that the Vikings are in this incredibly difficult window to navigate. They put themselves into that window. They knew it was going to be difficult. They may have even made the right decision by doing that. But now they've got a bunch of these tough choices to make. And if they go halfway, I don't think they'll be able to straddle the two lines. Because if they go halfway, I think they're not going to be able to take advantage of the window. And I don't think they'll be appropriately building for the future. I think if you go halfway, you can't do enough in either direction.
Next question is going to be from Raul, who asks, despite weak corners this year, the Vikings finished third in coverage rankings by PFF. Does this suggest guard could actually be a bigger draft need for us than corner? Is the best solution to draft a tackle and move Arif inside?
So the last part of that question, I mostly agree with. I think Reef, for example, translates to the inside a little bit better than Remmers does, because he doesn't have kind of the quickness off the snap problems that Remmers has. So there is that. I would see it kind of more like a Mike Harris moving inside than a Michael Remmers moving inside. But the coverage grade thing is bolstered a lot by, what Kendricks did and what the safeties did. And the coverage grade translates better than any other statistic in terms of projecting future coverage. But when you break it out by position, the position that translates the most to future coverage grade is cornerback. And so if you took a look at broad trends, you would say that the Vikings coverage is probably fine. But the deeper you look into it, the more likely it is to be unstable going forward. So I would still prioritize probably a cornerback, but it's tough. I don't know. I don't know the actual answer to this problem because it doesn't seem like there's cornerbacks or tackles, either of them, that will be amazingly great gets to get between the 40th pick in the draft and the 60th, right? I think that second round, you're not necessarily going to get, and this, I'm just basing it off of what I saw on Dan Brugler's big board. So maybe things change by the time February comes around, but I'm seeing a bunch of first round talent and not a ton of late second round talent. So that I'm concerned. I think if you had one or the other, I would say draft one in the first and the other one in the second. I suspect the tackles are more likely to fall than the corners, so I would probably take that corner first. Plus, corners just tend to be just a more important position generally. It is, again, tough because the Vikings do have more options there because they've got Holton Hill, they've got Mike Hughes, they could re-sign one of Mackenzie Alexander or Trey Wayne, so they've got more options there. So you could flip it around, but I don't know. It's really tough to navigate. I wish I knew the answer right now. I would say don't pay attention to the fact that the total coverage grade for the Vikings is that high, because the way that PFF has found to project that going forward is break it down by position. And by position, it's just not really great news for the Vikings, especially because they have to re-sign Anthony Harris in order to get a lot of that back. Yeah, it's tough. I wish I had a better answer.
Kyle Slaby asks, is this team going to be watchable next year? Half of our good coaches are gone, and the ones who stay will keep us down. I feel like the 2020 Vikings is going to be a lot like the 2019 Seahawks, without the great QB to bail them out when the rebuilding defense falters, and Rick Dennison, or insert similar blah OC candidate, runs 45 runs a game, down by 17. Hopefully we'll draft a punter in the 4th round because he's going to get used a lot.
2 good coaches left, and George Edwards. I'm not that concerned about some of this, but yeah, I just there is a problem where you might always kind of cap the ability of your offense because of the potential for Zimmer to try to force them to run the ball in situations that are just not that ideal, and the Vikings don't have the ability to overcome that. But I think if your offense is effective enough throwing the ball, Zimmer probably just shuts up. I don't. If the Vikings lose less games with John DeFilippo, and I don't think he was a great coordinator, I did advocate keeping him because I just think that you tend to fix a lot. Historically, coordinators fix a lot between year 1 and year 2. His issue was not how often he ran the ball or how often he threw it. His issue was that he didn't realize that Stephon Diggs was not Jarvis Landry, right? And that he was designing really poor pass plays and he was creating difficult progressions for Cousins, and he wasn't throwing it in play action all that often and stuff like that. His issue was from a design perspective. It wasn't run pass balance. But I think if the Vikings were scoring 40 points a game or whatever, I don't think Zimmer cares. So there's that possibility that Zimmer could kind of kneecap the offense a little bit by the way that he kind of influences their game planning. But I also think that if you're just like good enough, it doesn't matter. So I think there's the possibility that they're not going to be running the ball so much. I do think they got to stop running it as much as they do on 2nd and long. I think a lot of that has to do with Zimmer, but we'll see. I think that's a concern. I wouldn't say that that's a fireable offense for Zimmer because he's just such a good coach in other areas, but it is a concern. So yeah, I'm not that optimistic about run pass balance going forward, but I'm not like doom and gloom about it. And I think that's really the primary concern when it comes to the offensive side of the ball. On the defensive side of the ball, yeah, I'm worried about the defensive backs coach leaving, but I think the Vikings will probably figure it out.
Kirk Lindgren asks, do you think that if the Vikings had a mobile quarterback, not necessarily a runner, but one with greater ability to avoid pressure in the pocket, we would have been more successful this year?
Kirk, I say this with as much gratefulness that you listen to the show. So with all due respect, but I have no idea what this question means. Because if it's Kirk Cousins but mobile, then yeah, obviously that would be better. Is it, mobility trades off with something? Well, what is that something? Is it accuracy? Is it decision making? Is it arm strength? I don't know. Is it, I suspect that the spirit of this question is, whatever rank quarterback Kirk Cousins is, let's say he is the 8th best quarterback in the NFL. That's generous, but let's say he is. He's the 8th best quarterback in the NFL. What if he was mobile and he lost his other quarterback qualities to the extent that you'd still probably call him the 8th best quarterback in the NFL? Would that be better? I think that's the spirit of the question. And if that's the spirit of the question, I would say, given the way that offensive line is constructed, probably, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's definitively the case, because some of the stuff Cousins is good at is really great for quarterbacks or for receivers like Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, right? Because he's got pretty good arm strength and he uses it pretty well on those deep balls when he throws those deep balls, right? And his decision making is good in some contexts and pretty bad in other contexts. So if you decrease his decision making ability in order to kind of add mobility, if you're like doing Madden sliders or something, how catastrophic can it get? Like you avoid a sack and you throw an interception. I don't know. Again, you're still with like the quote unquote 8th best quarterback, but you might be limiting yourself from explosive plays because you don't get as many deep throws. So I kind of wish I knew what the other context of this question was. I'll say probably, but I'll say there's a lot of caveats to it.
Zen Cubit asks, out of the pending restructure/cut candidates, is there one that the Vikings must keep? The options are Linval, Reif, Rhodes, Everson, and Shamar Griffin. Or sorry, Shamar.
Shamar Griffin.
Yes, let's go with
that. No. So, well, maybe rather Reif. So we got Linval, Reif, Rhodes, Shamar, Everson. Am I missing anyone?
No. Linval, Reif, Rhodes, Everson, and Shamar.
Yeah, maybe Reif. Just because there's just like not that many offensive linemen. That's it. I wish they could keep Linval. He had a pretty good year. I'm really glad that they have Armin Watts, who could be a really good nose tackle, who's demonstrated pretty good play at nose tackle. And they'll need to, probably find another one, but Jaleel Johnson right now is like an all right backup nose tackle. I don't think he's all that great. If you want an alternate perspective, Stephen White, who used to play defensive line in the NFL, who now writes for SB Nation, he's a huge fan of Jaleel Johnson. So clearly there's potential there. But, they've got maybe an option or two at nose tackle, but I feel like we're on the wrong side of Joseph's career. We'll probably get 2 more good years out of him, and I think that might be optimistic. Griffin, I think you've probably got another year or two of good play left in him. He started off the year really strong, but I just think that the contract he would demand in free agency if he were cut is way higher than what the Vikings can afford. So I don't think you've got enough leverage to restructure him into something that'll make your cap hit really good, because he'd rather get cut and then make more money elsewhere, which more power to him. He's pretty talented. But the Vikings do have an option in Ifeadi Odenigbo. I would not hand him the job outright. I think he has played well enough to say he could be the starter. I would have him compete with a 3rd or 4th round pick, which, the Vikings are really phenomenal at finding. And in fact, I really wish that they had drafted someone like Max Crosby. And that's not just hindsight, seeing how well he's played this year. He was like one of my guys to draft in the middle or late rounds. So I would really like to see that last year. I think that would have been a better pick than Cameron Smith. And maybe I'll end up being wrong about that. Maybe Cameron Smith ends up being pretty good. I'm not saying he was a bad pick, but I'm just saying, I probably would have picked Max Crosby, and that would have been nice. But Griffin, you probably have to let go. Linval, there's a good case for letting him go. Rhodes, you just gotta. I don't think you can restructure him either. I don't necessarily think he's going to get a huge payday elsewhere. I do think he'll probably get paid more by another team than by the Vikings. But I think he's just kind of washed. Again, I do think that he played better than advertised this year. But I just don't know that the contract he'll demand is going to be the one that is going to return value for the Vikings. So there's that. And then Shamar's bad, so don't keep him.
Next question is from Eddie, who asks, first off, what's the deal with Mike Hughes' neck?
Seems fine. Mike Zimmer said that he's basically good to go. We'll see him, unless he has like a non-football injury or something like that during the offseason, we'll see him at OTAs. In fact, no player, according to Zimmer, no player is expected to get off-season surgery. So the Vikings kind of got a little bit lucky there.
Second question is, what's a realistic ceiling for a Vikings defense lacking Trey Waynes, Mackenzie Alexander, and Anthony Harris next season?
And Anthony Harris. Okay, so what you probably end up with, it seems like Jaron Kearse doesn't think he's going to come back, so take that into account. You'll probably end up with maybe Anderson Deo again at safety, which I think a lot of Vikings fans would be pretty disappointed by, plus another safety to try and compete for that spot. Probably late in the draft because the Vikings don't spend or haven't spent high on a safety since Harrison Smith. But yeah, let's assume that you've got a floor of Anderson Deo, and then you've got Holton Hill and Mike Hughes and somebody. A pick? I don't know. Hopefully not Chris Boyd. But yeah. The question was the ceiling? Or like just the overall expectation for the performance?
Ceiling.
Well, the ceiling, I mean, that's a top 5. Like 5th, I think. But that's a pretty so for me, ceiling always means like 5th percentile outcome. Like if you did a bell curve of all the available outcomes, 95% of outcomes are worse than this. That's the ceiling. You don't want to say, the ceiling is the absolute best they can do, but the best you can reasonably expect 1 in every 20 instances. And so I would say the 5th best defense in the NFL is like a 1 in 20 type shot you can see from that, just because, you're expecting to see development from Mike Hughes. Holton Hill is a pretty good player, that we've seen play pretty well. The Vikings have demonstrated some ability to manufacture some production out of the slot. So, there's that, but I would expect that that's kind of I would skew it, lower. And I would say that you've got a real opportunity to have, a slightly above average defense, in that scenario. And that's pretty scary, I think, because we haven't had a defense ranked outside of the top 10, at least by kind of like random estimations like DVOA and points per drive and stuff like that. I think since 2015, it would suck to go back to that.
All right. Next question is from Don from Ohio, who asks, how is Arif doing after James Madison University and the Seahawks lost in the playoffs on the same weekend?
I don't care about the Seahawks.
Even if somebody photoshops your picture onto the Mandalorian and photoshops themselves into the Baby Yoda like thing and claims to be from Seahawks Twitter? God
damn it.
That was an amazing header picture.
I can't believe that's his header picture.
That was pretty great. I'm just going to make an album of the, I think I actually do. I already have an album of the Arif Photoshops that I release every year on your birthday. So yeah, that one's getting put out. Also, A, extend Spielman and Zimmer 3 more years so they can oversee this rebuild and see if they can fix the team in a year or 2. Or B, fire them both and start new if they think this was the best that they can do.
Zimmer's capacity to produce wins is rare. I don't understand. Like, I was just talking about some of the problems that he might create by kneecapping an offense, by asking them to run the ball a little bit too much. And if you don't have an MVP quality quarterback, you might find yourself kind of at a disadvantage. But like, they have the 6th highest winning percentage since Zimmer joined the team. Like, that's tough. It's the 6th highest winning percentage of any active coach in the NFL. That's pretty difficult. And the thing is, everybody ranked above him has had stability at quarterback or an MVP, one of the two, right? Usually both, right? Because they've had Tom Brady, that's the Patriots. They've had Patrick Mahomes and Alex Smith. They've had Lamar Jackson and Joe Flacco. And they've had Drew Brees, right? And so like they've got a better winning percentage than the Packers. Although I think at the end of 2019 the Packers again pulled ahead, but they've got Rodgers. So Zimmer did it with 5 different quarterbacks. I think it's insane. Obviously, if you do a complete rebuild, and tear it all down, you'd probably want, if you're going to get a new coach and a new GM, you'd probably want to trade away all the players too. So just amass picks and create a young team. But that's a several year rebuild. And it would suck.
Or watch. One in the case of the Dolphins on their 3 first-round picks this year.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, if the Vikings, like, I guess you could trade Daniil Hunter for a couple of first rounders, right? I don't know if that's going to be part of your rebuild because he's going to be about a year older than your oldest draft picks anyway. So,
yeah.
But if you wanted a bunch of picks, that's one way to do it.
There you go. Let's just value that. Also, it was exhausting reading for 24 hours straight Arif shredding ignorant Vikings fans after Saturday's loss. It was as if Arif needed this to sustain life. Does Arif need to debate people consistently to sustain life? What would happen if he stopped? I shudder to think.
So I'm actually, in person-to-person interactions, pretty non-confrontational. I don't think anyone listening to this believes that.
I've sat next to you while you've gotten into arguments with people. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure I totally believe that, but if you want to think you're not the problem, then fine. If you're putting a microphone in front of me and I'm podcasting, then yeah, I'm performing, right? Like, so if you see me argue with somebody at a live show, that's not the same thing at all. I'll argue with like Luke, Inman in real life, I guess, but I don't know. I'm not that, so here's a story. I'm getting picked up at the Minneapolis airport. It's like 7 p.m. I've got to record a podcast at 8 to talk about Kevin Stefanski, to the Browns. And so this story was yesterday, right? And, it's difficult to get picked up because the traffic is super backed up, because the traffic cops or whatever there are like all on break or something absurd. There's no one there to direct traffic, which means people are just sitting there idling while no one is getting in their car. Right? Because they're just they got there like 30 minutes early and whoever they're picking up hasn't got their luggage yet. And so there's people waiting where their cars haven't arrived yet. And there's cars waiting where their people haven't arrived yet. And it's frustrating. And, some old white lady just starts yelling at everybody sitting, and God bless her, she's right. Starts just yelling at everybody with these open windows to just get a move on. And everyone is like, shocked, right? They're like, oh, this grandmotherly person is, yelling at me. What the hell? And she's yelling at people. And I was like, oh God, public confrontation. And I just kind of retreated, right? Ridiculous, right? But she's right. And she got some traffic moving, and my girlfriend was able to try and pick me up. Unfortunately, the traffic was still so bad that she was 4 lanes out, and I was just not going to get in that car. So she had to loop all the way around. Unfortunately, because of her yelling, she was able to get picked up by the car that was meant to pick her up. So win for her. But now again, no one is controlling traffic. And so people are stopped. And so my girlfriend is like 3 doors down. I didn't want to say that. Is 3 doors away from my pickup location. And she's like, it's just easier if you just like walk over to me. And it's like, okay. And there's this one person that's just been sitting there the whole time. 30 minutes she's been sitting there without having moved at all. And, as I'm texting my girlfriend, the traffic cops, come back and they tell her to move, and she moves forward like a foot.
and then they leave to tell other people to move, and then she backs up like 10 feet. Like the most frustrating thing I've ever seen. And I was like, this is insane. And I just stared at her, and she stared back and then didn't do anything. And I was like, well, that's it. That's the end of my interaction. And I was like, wow, I can't believe I don't have the balls to say anything. That's incredible. But I always don't have the balls to say anything because I'm a non-confrontational person. And the reason I surprised myself is because I decided I was going to walk down to that first door and get picked up by my girlfriend. And I just noticed that the window was open to this person that was just sitting there holding up everybody's traffic. And I walked past the window's open, and I'm like, you're holding everybody up. Please move. And I shocked myself. I was like, oh my God, I said something in public to a stranger. And she's like, well, when I moved, no one else was moving, and that's why I backed up. And I'm like, the person behind you also needs to move. Like, it's absurd. I've been waiting for 30 minutes because there's somebody in a location that can't pick me up because you won't move. And she's like, well, the person behind me is not going to move. And I'm like, you know what? I'm sorry. I don't want to argue. I cannot believe I apologized. So then I left and got in the car.
I like how I was nearly in a bar fight this weekend, and you were the one who was like actually.
I'm not confrontational. I just when I'm on Twitter, it's like easy. Everyone knows everybody online is confrontational. It's very easy. But like this person who's actually impacting people's lives, been waiting out in the cold for 45 minutes now, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said anything. I'm moving.
I like to think that as soon as you got in the car. You just had a moment of, I am sustained for another 24 hours. This was in person. This was the real stuff. And then just started like tapping your vein afterwards. Like, I'm good.
The real deal.
This is
now that I'm methadone online. I was probably arguing about Stefanski online while that was happening. And in real life, I'm just like, yelling.
You're like, I wonder what happens if you mix methadone and heroin. This sounds like a winning combination. All right, let's talk about your writing, because that's something that we talk about around here. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Yes, I wrote a 4,000-word piece over The Athletic. My editor thankfully cut it down, but only to, unfortunately, 3,700 words. It's a long piece about the quandary the Vikings have hitting this offseason. It does not actually go over what I think the Vikings should do. That's how long it takes to talk about the setup for the Vikings offseason. But I was worried that it would feel substanceless. I got a bunch of, there's like 98 comments right now. And I got a bunch of feedback on the piece and on Twitter that it was actually a really good read. So I'm really happy about that because I was pretty uncertain about the piece. So you can check that out over at The Athletic later this week. I think Friday I'm going to publish probably an example of an off-season plan. And we'll see how that does. But that's what's going on at The Athletic. And then tomorrow morning, there should be a mailbag published. I have not written a word of it as of this recording, but by the time you listen to it, it should be done.
Excellent. Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Again, we're going to be winding down. I wouldn't expect another episode later this week. I would expect maybe one next week and one for the Super Bowl as well. So for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you to Eric as well for bouncing in and having a couple of things to say as well.
No, thank you, Eric. If you see Eric, tell him I'm sorry. I don't want to argue.
I like how you're recusing yourself of that for just a moment. Wow, this is a new Arif. This is terrifying.
This is an old Arif. I don't argue in real life with people unless it's on a podcast. Mm-hmm. Or about Carson Wentz. I got into a fight in a bar about Carson Wentz. We've told this story before.
Well, yes. that's just good. That's just good, wholesome fun. For Arif, Eric, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. Thank you guys for the support this season. Really do appreciate it. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we'll see you guys probably next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.